The hum of the strange machine in the corner of the mess hall cut through the silence like a knife. Lieutenant Eric Mueller froze mid-step, his aluminum tray suspended between the serving counter and the nearest table. His eyes darted toward the wooden cabinet emitting colored light and mechanical whirring. The other German prisoners hesitated too, their movements becoming cautious, deliberate. For weeks, they had grown accustomed to the rhythms of Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The roll calls, the work details, the strange abundance of American rations. But this device, newly installed in the dining area, radiated an unfamiliar energy that set their nerves on edge. When an American guard sauntered over, dropped a nickel into a slot, and pressed a button, the prisoners flinched collectively. But instead of danger, music erupted, washing over the room in waves of brass, piano, and drums. Glenn Miller's In the Mood filled every corner of the mess hall, its swinging rhythm as alien to the captured soldiers as the Mississippi heat. Eric watched as the guard walked away, whistling along, completely unconcerned, as if he hadn't just casually unleashed something miraculous. The contraption's front panel glowed with shifting colors, and through a glass window, they could see a mechanical arm selecting a record, placing it on a turntable. A jukebox, the Americans called it, stood like a temple of sound and light in a prisoner of war camp thousands of miles from home. For men raised in the shadow of Nazi rallies, where music served only the state, this casual display of musical freedom felt like witnessing something forbidden. Eric's hands trembled slightly as he set his tray down. The food, already shocking in its abundance, now seemed secondary to this mechanical marvel that served no purpose except enjoyment. "They waste electricity on music?" whispered Karl Heinz, a former Panzer driver. "For prisoners?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the melody continued. Some prisoners continued eating mechanically, eyes fixed on their plates, as if acknowledging this luxury might burn them. Others stared openly, measuring the distance between themselves and this glowing altar of American excess. It was not simply the technology that unsettled them. Germany had radios and phonographs too, but the staggering implication that even in wartime, their captors considered music not a luxury, but a necessity, available at the drop of a coin, even to the enemy. The song ended, and for a moment silence returned, more deafening than the music had been. Then another guard approached, inserted another nickel, and Frank Sinatra's voice filled the room, crooning about the moon and the stars. A few prisoners exchanged glances, their faces tight with an emotion difficult to name. Not quite envy, not quite wonder, but a complicated mixture that tasted of both. A sergeant from Bremen pushed his half-eaten potatoes away and whispered, "If they feed their prisoners like kings and give them music machines, what must life be like for their citizens?" No one answered. No one needed to. That night, after lights out, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations about the strange machine. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed it contained 500 different songs. Others insisted it was part of some psychological experiment designed to break their spirits by showing them what they'd never have. A few even suggested it might be broadcasting secret messages to American spies. But beneath the theories ran a current of uncomfortable truth. This jukebox represented something fundamentally different about America, something the Reich's propaganda had never prepared them for. "My cousin wrote from the Russian front last winter," Karl said into the darkness. "They were eating horse meat when they could find it, their fingers blackened with frostbite while manning artillery. And here we sit, with bellies full, listening to dance music like we're at a Berlin cabaret." The silence that followed was heavier than any guard's order. What defense did ideology have against such a display? What rhetoric could stand against the simple reality of a nickel dropped into a slot, producing joy without purpose, except to make existence more bearable, even for the enemy? Sergeant Werner Hoffmann had spent 37 months fighting with the Afrika Korps before his capture in Tunisia. He had survived sandstorms that stripped paint from tanks, water rationing that left men delirious, and British artillery barrages that turned the desert into a landscape of craters. Nothing had prepared him for the strangeness of American captivity. When he first entered the mess hall at Camp McCain, another Mississippi facility housing German prisoners, he expected thin soup and stale bread, the rations of defeat. Instead, he found trays piled with eggs, bacon, and coffee so abundant that prisoners left half-full cups without a second thought. But it was the music that bewildered him. That first morning, as he stood holding his tray, a song began playing from the wooden cabinet in the corner. Werner froze, the familiar notes washing over him like a visitation from another life. It was Lily Marlene, the very song German soldiers had sung in North African trenches, now playing openly in an American prison camp. He approached the machine cautiously, examining the glowing panel. Behind glass, a mechanical arm selected records with precision that would impress engineers at Zeiss. An American guard noticed his fascination. "Jukebox," the guard said, pointing. "You can play anything you want, if you've got a nickel." He flipped a coin to Werner, who caught it reflexively. "Try it." Werner stood motionless, the nickel heavy in his palm. Was this a trick? A test? He had been warned about American psychological warfare, about traps designed to compromise his loyalty. Yet the guard was already walking away, unconcerned, as if he hadn't just handed the enemy the key to a forbidden pleasure. With hesitant fingers, Werner inserted the coin and pressed a button at random. The mechanism whirred, and suddenly Tommy Dorsey's orchestra filled the room with a swing tempo that made his feet want to move of their own accord. "They let us choose the music," he murmured to himself. "Any music we want." The concept was so foreign that he struggled to process it. In Germany, radio broadcasts had been tightly controlled for years. The Reichsrundfunk dictated what citizens could hear, which composers were acceptable, which lyrics supported the proper ideology. Jazz had been denounced as degenerate, the product of inferior races. Yet here it played freely, its rhythms bouncing off the walls of a prison camp, as if in deliberate defiance of everything Werner had been taught. That evening, after work detail, Werner found himself drawn back to the mess hall, though he wasn't hungry. A small crowd of prisoners had gathered around the jukebox, watching as an American corporal demonstrated how to operate it. The machine contained nearly 200 records, songs in English, Spanish, even a few German folk tunes. Each prisoner received a weekly allowance of nickels from their labor pay, and they could spend them however they chose. Some bought cigarettes or toiletries from the camp canteen, others saved for postcards to send home. But increasingly, the nickels found their way into the jukebox's hungry slot, transforming the mess hall into something that resembled not a prison, but a cafe. "Why do they let us have this?" asked a young private who had been captured in Italy. "It makes no sense." Werner had been wondering the same thing. In captivity, he expected deprivation, punishment, perhaps even the abuses they had been warned about. Instead, they received 3 meals a day, medical care, and now music on demand. It defied every expectation, every warning about American barbarism. More disturbing still was the implication. If America could afford such luxuries for enemy prisoners, what did that suggest about the Reich's chances in this war? "Perhaps," Werner said slowly, "they want us to see what we're fighting against." But even as he spoke, he knew the explanation felt inadequate. The jukebox wasn't propaganda. It was simply there, offering pleasure without message, enjoyment without purpose. Its very purposelessness made it more powerful than any lecture or film could have been. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Camp Aliceville's mess hall, catching the polished surfaces of the Wurlitzer jukebox that stood against the far wall. Its chrome details gleamed, and the colored bubbles in its tubes shifted hypnotically, casting small rainbows across the worn linoleum floor. Corporal Karl Heinz found himself drawn to it as if by magnetism, despite his attempts to maintain a soldier's discipline even in captivity. He had arrived at the Alabama camp 3 weeks earlier with hundreds of other Wehrmacht prisoners captured in North Africa, and each day brought new disorienting revelations about American life. The jukebox had been installed only yesterday, a donation from a nearby town's renovated diner, according to the guards. All night, Karl had heard his fellow prisoners debating its significance. Some saw it as propaganda, others as a luxury beyond comprehension. A few even suspected it contained hidden microphones to record their conversations. But none could deny its magnetic allure. As Carl approached, he noticed another prisoner already standing before it, studying the song list with the intensity of a man deciphering a military code. "They have everything," whispered Otto Braun, a Berlin University student before the war. "American jazz, classical, even German songs." His finger traced the glass-covered list. "Look, they even have Die Lorelei. How can they allow this? It was banned at home for being composed by Mendelssohn." Carl stared at the song titles, recognizing only a few. The majority were American names that meant nothing to him. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, the Andrews Sisters. Music that had been denounced as degenerate, corrupt, the product of racial mixing and cultural degradation. Yet here it was, offered freely even to prisoners of war. An American guard approached, jingling coins in his palm. "You fellas want to hear something?" he asked through a translator. Without waiting for an answer, he dropped a nickel into the slot and pressed a button. The machine hummed to life, its internal mechanisms whirring as a record dropped onto the turntable. A moment later, Bing Crosby's voice filled the room, singing about moonlight and romance. The guard smiled, apparently satisfied with the reaction of stunned silence, and walked away. The song enveloped the mess hall, wrapping around the prisoners as they ate their breakfast. Carl watched his comrades' reactions with fascination. Some kept their eyes fixed on their plates, refusing to acknowledge the music, as if enjoying it might constitute treason. Others tapped their fingers lightly against the tables, their bodies responding to rhythms they had been taught to despise. A few of the younger men bobbed their heads slightly, then caught themselves, looking around guiltily as if they had been caught in some forbidden act. When the song ended, the mess hall fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the clinking of utensils against plates. Then, after a moment, another prisoner rose from his table, walked deliberately to the jukebox, and inserted a coin. His selection brought forth a German folk song, Du liegst mir im Herzen, its familiar melody prompting a visible wave of emotion across the room. Men who had maintained rigid military bearing for weeks suddenly seemed to soften, their shoulders relaxing, their eyes taking on a distant look that suggested they were no longer in Alabama, but somewhere far away. In mountain villages, in Munich beer halls, in living rooms where families gathered around simpler radios. "I never thought I would betray the fatherland with my ears," Otto Meyer whispered, his voice barely audible over the swing music filling the mess hall. He sat with 3 other prisoners at a corner table, nursing cups of coffee that would have been unimaginable luxuries in the North African campaign. The jukebox across the room glowed with internal lights, its mechanical arm visible through the glass panel as it selected another record. Benny Goodman gave way to Tommy Dorsey, the transition so smooth it seemed the machine itself was curating their musical education. "Is it betrayal to listen?" asked Friedrich Weber, a former artillery officer. "We are prisoners. We have no choice but to hear." But his foot tapped gently against the floor, betraying his enjoyment of the forbidden rhythms. "The choice is in the pleasure," Otto replied. "I was raised on Wagner and Strauss. I was taught that this music was degenerate, primitive, beneath German culture. Yet now I find myself waiting for certain songs, anticipating them like letters from home." He looked down at his empty hands, as if they might still hold the guilt of his admission. "What does that make me?" No one answered. The question hung between them, heavier than any they had faced on the battlefield. 4 weeks had passed since the jukebox arrived at Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida, and in that time it had accomplished what interrogators never could. It had cracked open something in the German prisoners, revealing contradictions they could no longer reconcile. Hans Breitner, the youngest at their table, had been a Hitler youth leader before joining the Wehrmacht. His indoctrination had been the most complete, his belief in German racial and cultural superiority the most unshakable. Yet now he leaned toward the others with the urgency of confession. "Last night I dreamed I was dancing to In the Mood with a girl from my village," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I woke up, I felt ashamed, as if I had betrayed something. But then I wondered, what exactly had I betrayed?" The dream felt more real, more human than anything I experienced in 2 years of fighting. Across the mess hall, the jukebox continued its work, indifferent to the crisis of conscience it had sparked. American guards moved between tables, collecting trays, occasionally dropping nickels into the machine to keep the music flowing. To them, the jukebox was simply a morale booster, a way to make the camp run more smoothly. They could not see the internal battles it provoked in men who had been raised to believe that culture was a weapon in a global race war. The scale of American abundance became clear on a Wednesday afternoon when supply trucks arrived at Camp Shelby. Eric Mueller watched from the recreation yard as a convoy of 6 vehicles rumbled through the main gates, their beds loaded with crates and boxes. Most contained the usual provisions: food, medical supplies, maintenance equipment. But one truck carried something different, a second jukebox, larger and more elaborate than the first, destined for the camp's newly constructed recreation hall. "They're bringing another one?" Carl whispered, incredulous, as if one music machine weren't enough extravagance. Eric nodded, his eyes fixed on the workers unloading the massive Wurlitzer. Its wooden tabinet gleamed with fresh varnish, and chrome details caught the Mississippi sunlight. He had become familiar with the jukebox in the mess hall, even developing preferences among its selections. But the arrival of a second machine struck him as almost obscene in its excess. While German cities endured bombing raids and civilians scraped by on ration cards, American prison camps received luxury items as casually as if they were basic necessities. According to the camp translator, this new jukebox contained 500 selections, more than twice the capacity of the first. It had been donated by a music distributor in New Orleans who was upgrading his inventory and considered the outdated model perfect for the POW camp. The notion that something so magnificent could be considered obsolete boggled the mind. Eric had grown up in Dresden, where his father owned a small radio repair shop. He understood the mechanics of audio equipment, the complexity of building devices that reproduced sound faithfully. The engineering that went into these jukeboxes represented technical sophistication that rivaled anything he had seen in Germany. That evening, the recreation hall opened its doors for the first time. American guards ushered groups of prisoners inside, presenting the space with an almost proprietary pride. Besides the jukebox, the hall contained a small library, chess tables, a ping-pong set, and a radio. These amenities had been provided not by the military, but by local churches and civic organizations. Ordinary Americans contributing to the comfort of men who had been trying to kill their sons and brothers only months before. "Why would they do this?" Eric asked an English-speaking guard as the first music began to play. "We are the enemy. This makes no sense." The guard shrugged. "Geneva Convention says we gotta treat you decent. Besides, happy prisoners cause less trouble." He gestured toward a group of Germans already selecting songs from the illuminated panel. "Seems to be working, doesn't it?" But Eric sensed there was more to it than pragmatism. The casual generosity spoke to something deeper about American society, a confidence so absolute that it could afford kindness even to enemies, a prosperity so vast that even prison camps reflected a standard of living that would be considered luxurious in many parts of war-torn Europe. The contrast with what he knew of Russian prison camps, where German soldiers froze and starved by the thousands, could not have been more stark. By 1944, American factories were producing over 11 million records per year. Jukeboxes were so commonplace that even small-town diners contained them. The music industry thrived despite wartime restrictions, with soldiers overseas receiving regular shipments of the latest hits. When Eric compared this to Germany, where metal shortages had all but ended civilian phonograph production and where radio broadcasts were tightly controlled by the propaganda ministry, the technological gap became undeniable. Even more revealing were the logistical implications. A jukebox required not just manufacturing capacity, but an entire support system. Electricity and steady supply, maintenance technicians, a distribution network for new records, replacement parts readily available. That America could sustain such infrastructure, even while fighting a two-front global war, suggested industrial capacity beyond anything the Reich's leadership had acknowledged. The transformation was most visible in the younger prisoners. Hans Breitner, who had once been the most fervent believer in Nazi ideology, now spent his canteen allowance almost exclusively on jukebox plays. His collection of swing records grew inside his head, memorized notes and lyrics replacing the slogans and anthems of the Hitler Youth. The change worried some of the older officers, who saw in it not just a shift in musical taste, but a dangerous weakening of German identity. "You're becoming American," Major Leitner told Hans one evening, finding him near the jukebox with a handful of nickels. "Is that what you want? To forget who you are, where you come from?" Hans considered the question seriously. 6 months earlier, he would have recoiled at the accusation, protesting his loyalty with rehearsed fervor. Now he simply shrugged. "The music doesn't make me less German, Herr Major. It just makes me more human." The response earned him extra work detail as punishment, but even as he scrubbed pots in the camp kitchen, Hans found himself whistling Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. The tune had taken root in him, impossible to extract without removing something essential about the person he was becoming. He wasn't alone. Throughout the camp, German soldiers who had once marched to military bands now hummed jazz standards, their bodies unconsciously adopting the looser rhythms of American music. For Werner Hoffmann, the former Afrika Korps sergeant, the transformation was more intellectual than physical. He had begun keeping a journal, page after page, analyzing the differences between German and American culture as reflected in their music. Weil während germische Kompositionen Order, Präzision und kollektive Emotion die zur nationalen Paupus bereiteten, amerikanische Songs zelebrierten individuelle Expression, Improvisation und persönliches Feeling. Der Kontrast, hier beliebte, revealte fundamentale Differenzen in how die zwei Sozietäten unterstanden Human Liberty. In German-Musik, even when expressing joy, is always a sense of destiny, of larger purpose, he wrote eine Nacht. Der Individuum served something beyond himself. But in American jazz, the soloist breaks free from the group, exploring his own path before returning to the collective. It is a different vision of freedom, not freedom to serve the state, but freedom von the state itself. Christmas 1944 markte einen Turning Point. Die Camp-Autoritäten, folgend amerikanischer Tradition, dekorierten das Messhall mit Peinbrändchen und colored lights. A small tree stood near the jukebox, which had been programmed with seasonal music, both American Christmas carols and traditional German Weihnachtslieder. On Christmas Eve, prisoners gathered for a special meal, after which both Germans and Americans joined in singing Silent Night, first in English, then in its original German as Stille Nacht. The moment was electric, enemies sharing not only a song, but its deepest meaning, transcending the barriers of language and conflict. For many prisoners, it was the first time they had felt truly human since their capture, connected to something larger than the war that had defined their lives for years. As the singing ended, someone played Bing Crosby's White Christmas on the jukebox. The mess hall fell silent, prisoners and guards alike caught in a shared web of homesickness and hope. Later that night, Werner wrote in his journal, "I begin to understand that music is not merely entertainment, but a weapon of a different kind. It does not destroy the body, but transforms the mind. The Reich built walls around our culture to protect us from degeneration. But in doing so, they imprisoned our spirits as surely as this camp imprisons our bodies. Here, ironically, I have discovered a freedom I never knew at home, the freedom to choose what enters my ears and touches my heart." The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and distant rain through the open windows of Camp Cain's recreation hall. Summer was ending, bringing cooler nights to Mississippi, but inside, the atmosphere remained warm with human activity. Several dozen German prisoners gathered around the jukebox, a heated debate underway about which songs to play with their limited supply of nickels. The discussion had the intensity of a military strategy session, with factions forming around different musical genres and artists. "We should play Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing," argued a former tank commander from Hanover. "If we're going to listen to jazz, let's hear the best." "No, something we can dance to," countered a young infantry private. "Glenn Miller's String of Pearls." "What about something from home?" suggested an older Luftwaffe pilot, his weathered face revealing homesickness beneath military discipline. "They have Lily Marlene." Major Kurt Brenner watched from a distance, nursing a cup of coffee that would have been unimaginably luxurious during the North African campaign. 15 months in American captivity had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. His physical transformation was obvious. Regular meals had filled out his once gaunt frame. Medical care had healed the persistent desert rash that had plagued him in Tunisia, and regular showers had restored a cleanliness he had forgotten was possible. But the inner changes ran deeper, harder to define, yet impossible to deny. The music had played a central role in this metamorphosis, creating fault lines and beliefs he once considered unshakable. Kurt remembered his first encounter with the jukebox as if it were yesterday. The shock of hearing American swing freely played, the strange mixture of guilt and pleasure, the feeling of crossing some invisible line simply by allowing himself to enjoy forbidden rhythms. Now, months later, he could name dozens of American musicians, distinguish between swing and bebop, and even explain the evolution of jazz from its New Orleans origins to the sophisticated orchestrations of Duke Ellington. This knowledge felt dangerous, almost treasonous, yet he carried it within him like a secret treasure. "Major," called a voice, breaking his reverie. A young lieutenant approached, snapping to attention with military precision that seemed increasingly out of place in the casual atmosphere of the camp. "The men were wondering if you would make the final selection tonight. It's the last play before the hall closes." Kurt nodded, surprised by the deference. Once, his rank had commanded automatic respect. Now, in this strange territory between war and peace, such gestures felt like echoes from another life. Still, he rose and made his way to the jukebox, aware of the eyes following him. The prisoners had pooled their last nickels for this final song, entrusting him with a choice that seemed to carry symbolic weight beyond mere entertainment. He studied the illuminated panel with its neat rows of titles, some now as familiar as old friends. His finger hovered for a moment over Wagner, a patriotic choice that would affirm German identity even in defeat. But something held him back. Perhaps the recognition that such music now carried darker associations, forever entangled with a regime whose crimes were becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Instead, he selected something that would have been unthinkable months earlier: Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." The choice sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Armstrong was black, his music emblematic of everything Nazi racial theory had condemned. Yet as the first notes filled the recreation hall, the prisoners fell silent, captivated by the warmth of Armstrong's gravelly voice, singing of trees of green and skies of blue. The lyrics spoke of hope and beauty in simple terms that transcended nationality and ideology, offering a vision of life after war that felt both impossible and necessary. The official surrender of Germany came on a clear May morning in 1945, announced over camp loudspeakers in a brief statement read by American officers. The news was hardly surprising. Prisoners had been following the Allied advance across Europe through permitted newspapers. Yet the finality of it still landed like a physical blow. Men who had maintained military bearing through months of captivity now slumped on barracks steps, staring into middle distance as the reality of total defeat settled upon them. That evening, the camp administration made an unprecedented decision. The mess hall and recreation building would remain open all night, with the jukeboxes free to play without coins. Guards were instructed to maintain security, but to allow prisoners space to process their new reality. It was a gesture of unexpected compassion, recognizing that these men needed something more powerful than words to help them navigate the complex emotions of this historical moment. Erich Mueller found himself drawn to the recreation hall as darkness fell. The jukebox glowed in the corner, several prisoners already clustered around it, their expressions solemn as they made selections. The music that filled the room was not what he expected.
Anstatt von Volkssongs oder klassischen Pieces, das might evoke patriotic nostalgie, they chose American jazz. Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo mit its blue notes und melancholy trumpet soaring above deep, velvety harmonies. Strange choice for tonight, Erich remarkte zu Karl, who stood nearby. Karl shook his head. Not strange at all. German music would hurt too much right now. This, he gestured toward the jukebox, this belongs to no country. It just speaks to how we feel. Throughout that long night, as victory celebrations surely erupted across America, the prisoners of Camp McCain engaged in their own form of commemoration. Not of the Reichsfall, but of their own survival and the uncertain future that awaited them. The jukeboxes played continuously, weaving together musical traditions that politics had tried to separate.
Jazz mingled with classical, American popular songs with German lieder, creating a sonic tapestry that defied the neat categories of friend and enemy, victor and vanquished. Repatriation began in the autumn of 1945, with groups of prisoners gradually processed for return to a Germany now divided between Allied occupation zones. As they prepared to leave, many experienced a surprising reluctance, not because they wished to remain prisoners, but because they feared what awaited them in a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. The camps, despite their barbed wire and guard towers, had become familiar, even comfortable in their predictability. The world beyond promised only uncertainty. On his last night at Camp Shelby, Erich Müller made his way to the mess hall for a final visit to the jukebox that had become such an unexpected presence in his life. The room was mostly empty, other prisoners busy with preparations for tomorrow's departure. The machine stood silent in the corner, its colored lights shifting hypnotically behind glass. Eric approached it with a sense of ceremony, turning over in his palm the last nickel he had saved from his work allowance. He studied the song list carefully, wanting to make this final selection count. His finger traced the titles, remembering when these names had meant nothing to him, when this music had seemed alien and threatening. Now they were familiar companions, guides to an emotional landscape he had never expected to explore. Finally, he made his choice, Frank Sinatra's "I'll Be Seeing You." As the music began, Eric closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. The song spoke of remembrance, of carrying the image of someone or something in your heart after parting. It seemed fitting for this moment of transition, this farewell to a strange chapter of his life. Finally, he made his choice, Frank Sinatra's "I'll Be Seeing You." When he opened his eyes, he found an American guard watching him from across the room, a knowing expression on his face. "That's a good one," the guard said, approaching. "My wife and I danced to it the night before I shipped out." Eric nodded, momentarily at a loss for words. After months of captivity, conversations with guards still carried a certain awkwardness, the inescapable reality of their different positions. Yet music had created a bridge of sorts, a territory where they could meet as something closer to equals. The following morning, as prisoners boarded transport trucks that would begin their long journey home, an unexpected sound drifted across the assembly area. Someone had wheeled one of the jukeboxes outside the mess hall, its cords stretched to reach a distant outlet. Als die deutschen Soldaten formten Leinen mit ihren migren Belangungen, playte Glenn Millers American Patrol in der Background. Ein Big-Band-Arrangement, das inkorporierte both Yankee Doodle und Militärmarschrhythmen. Der Choice siemte deliberiert, ein finales Statement von den amerikanischen Captors. Wir senden ihr changed bei was ihr erlebt habt hier. Ihr kamt als Enemies, ihr lebt, kehren Pieces unserer Kulturwind in ihr. Es war weder Gloating noch Rekonziliation, doch Samtmoor Sattler. Eine Anerkennung, das Wortsend nicht erreißt, was habte. Brandt formierte es in etwas, das meint, eventuell Bridges rather than Walls. Jahre später, in den Rebuilding Cities von Westdeutschland, American Music würde rückkehren. First durch Armed Forces Radio, dann durch importierte Records und final durch deutsche Musiker, die absorbierten Jazz, Swing und Early Rock'n'Roll in ihre eigene kreative Expression. Former prisoners, now civilians rebuilding their lives, would sometimes pause when hearing a familiar melody, transported momentarily back to Mississippi mess halls and Florida recreation rooms, where jukeboxes had glowed in the darkness. For these men, the music carried meanings that those who hadn't experienced captivity could never fully understand. It spoke not just of American culture, but of a time when identity had been unmade and remade, when certainties collapsed and new possibilities emerged. The jukeboxes had performed their quiet revolution, one song at a time, reshaping, not through force, but through the freedom to choose, to listen, to feel, to change. And so, as we consider the vast tapestry of World War II, with its epic battles and world-changing consequences, perhaps we should pause to remember these smaller revolutions, the moments when prisoners of war discovered unexpected freedoms in captivity, when music crossed boundaries that armies could not defend, when jukeboxes and mess halls became portals to another way of seeing the world. Have you ever wondered how many similar stories remain untold, hidden in the shadows of history's grand narratives? What quiet revolutions unfold even now in unexpected places, reshaping how we understand ourselves and each other? Perhaps, by listening carefully, we might hear them still playing.